Welcome, everyone. We're just going to give people a couple minutes to join us. And we'll wait just about one more minute for latecomers.
Great.
Well, I think I'll get started since the first couple of minutes is just me talking, and that's not what people came for. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Tova Wang. I'm a Democracy Fellow at the Ash Center at the Kennedy School at Harvard. And so before we begin, I want to, first of all, thank the Ash Center for hosting this. And the Ash Center would like to acknowledge the land on which Harvard sits as the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people, and a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. So the bunch of us are going to have some discussion at the outset, and then we'll be leaving the last 15 minutes or so for questions and answers. We're going to ask for you to put your questions in the Q&A box, and I will be trying to go through them as we go. And you should know that this is being recorded, and you can find it later or circulate it later. It's going to be on the Ash Center website as well as on YouTube. So I've been wondering if I could say on this website, now that the election is over, and was really, I've been afraid to say it, but I think now that Putin says it's so, and even McConnell secondarily says it's so, I think we could say it's so. So now that the election is over, so I don't think that I need to really recap for anyone here what we've just been through with this election. And I do want to start by saying that I join with the others who have been effusive in their praise of election workers and all the poll workers and everyone who worked really hard to make this election go well on election day. At the same time, I feel obliged to point out that there was plenty of voter suppression and disenfranchisement prior to election day that we don't want to forget about. And a lot of it was dictated by state legislatures who were trying to restrict the vote, and conservative courts who were very friendly to them, and some suppression that didn't work thanks to really brilliant litigation. Something that I don't think is discussed enough, and therefore I'm taking this moment to point it out, is that I think the biggest disenfranchisement that happened almost 2 years ago in Florida, when after 2/3 of the people of Florida passed a constitutional amendment allowing people with previous felony convictions to vote, and Ron DeSantis, the governor, and the state legislature there basically blocked it, and it's been bouncing around the courts ever since. And I think that alone disenfranchised tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people in Florida. So just want to point that out. And now that we are past that, we are continuing to see the claims of voter fraud. And I am really kind of a little nervous about a reprise of what happened in 2010 when the state legislatures, using the claim of fraud, enacted a whole slew of disenfranchising laws. So the question here today is, what are we going to do at all different levels to make sure that voting remains accessible and inclusive? And so we have amazing, amazing, amazing guests to talk to us about this. And I'm just going to introduce them quickly, and then we'll get into the questions. So first of all, we're really lucky to have Congressman Jamie Raskin, who, by the way, is a graduate of the law school and the college. And he serves on the House Judiciary Oversight and Rules Committee and is a member of the House Democratic Leadership. And we all fondly know him as a professor of constitutional law for a quarter of a century at American University, where he was a leading expert for all of us to turn to, author of several books on the topic. Wendy Underhill heads the elections and redistricting team at the National Conference of State Legislatures, which, if you don't know, is an unbelievable resource on election law. NCSL is the nation's bipartisan organization supporting the work of legislators and legislative staff throughout the nation. And elections officials, policy advocates, and the media relied on NCSL's data on mail voting in 2020 and has relied on it for information for many years before that. And going forward, they'll certainly have a lot of resources on redistricting. Dr. Carmen Lopez is Democracy Program Director for the State Innovation Exchange, known as SIX. She also is a Harvard HKS grad, actually. And for 25 years, she's been working on getting more people to engage in the process and in political reform. She organized to improve access to voting and elections so that all voices can be heard, to implement ranked choice voting, to ensure that every vote counts, to expand public financing so that locals can run for office with the support of their community rather than relying on donors, to build community journalism to tell local stories that lead to policy change, which is also an underreported story, and to elect more progressive women. And finally, Heather McGee, who I had the pleasure of working with for many years, joined Demos in 2002 and served as its president from 2014 through June 2018. She's now a trustee emeritus on the Demos board. Her first book, The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together, is coming out, what was it, February, Valentine's Day-ish, something like that. It's available for pre-order, I want to say. Sure. Local bookstore, or if you have to, Amazon. And so she's also, as many of you may know, a contributor to NBC and a frequent appearance on shows like Meet the Press. So let's get into it. And I'm going to start with the federal, and then we're going to talk about the state, and then we're going to sort of talk big picture. So I'm going to start with Congressman Raskin. So there's been a lot of interest the last few years in democracy reform at the federal level, including H.R. 1, which is supposed to be the #1 priority in 2018, and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. So what are we thinking going forward, given the issues that have arisen this year? And what do you think are the prospects for democracy reform at the federal level at this point?
Tova, thank you for inviting me, and thanks to Miles Rappaport and all my friends at the Ash Center, the Kennedy School, and I'm delighted to be on with Wendy and Heather and to participate in this conversation. So HR 1 will remain HR 1, and I think that it will be overwhelmingly the same as it was in 18. Not completely, there will be some minor changes, but the more you change it, then the more difficult it becomes to keep the coalition that passed it the first time. And while we're hopeful that we might bring some Republicans over, we're not placing any big bets on that. So we really need to keep the Democratic coalition together. As you know, HR 1 includes everything from sweeping gerrymander reform, basically getting rid of gerrymandering at the federal level and replacing it with independent, nonpartisan redistricting commissions, to campaign finance reform. There are several measures that are based on bills that I'd introduced, including the Get Foreign Money Out provisions, an amendment that I introduced actually on the floor that passed by 6 or 7 votes, which is the Shareholders United provision, which says, okay, as long as we've got Citizens United, if corporations are going to be putting money into politics, the premise of it is built into Justice Kennedy's opinion that the corporation is just reflecting the political views of the shareholders. Well, if that's the case, then no corporation should be able to spend any money in politics without a prior vote of the shareholders, a majority vote of the shareholders to actually make that expenditure. I mean, as you know, what is actually practically the necessary case is that the shareholders don't know anything about it, and the CEOs are converting the corporate treasuries into political slush funds for themselves. So in any event, so HR 1 will come back. It'll come back fast. It'll come back big, and that will be the core of it. But as you know, the nightmare of this election has exposed and exacerbated a number of other deficiencies in our electoral system. I think it has laid bare the dangerousness of having the current Electoral College system, where every nook and cranny becomes an opportunity for strategic mischief and intervention by those who have no real faith with democracy as a practice and a system. So I think we will be looking at other fixes related to that. I think there will be renewed and much greater pressure for a constitutional amendment, just guaranteeing people the right to vote. As you know, we've got this ragtag ad hoc sequence of anti-discrimination amendments, the 15th and the 19th and the 23rd and the 24th and the 26th, but nowhere do we have what you find like in the new South Africa Constitution in Article 1, which is a direct, affirmative, universal grant of voting rights to everybody at every level of government. So I think that could have, that could have some momentum. I think that certainly statehood for Washington, D.C. is going to come back in full force. We got every Democrat in the House to support it except for one. And I think he's has not been sent back to the House. So I think we're going to have unanimous support for D.C. statehood. I personally favor Puerto Rican statehood at the same time. And the John Lewis Voting Rights Act is going to be essential. So, but put it this way, I think that the 2020 election has made everybody in certainly the House side, and I think the Democrats in the Senate, more determined to fix all of the structural defects that we've got in our electoral system. And democracy means a lot of things. It has a lot of repercussions and a lot of implications. But at the very heart of it, you've got to have an electoral machinery and electoral practices that allow for the translation of the public will. And I think we're coming in with a lot of determination about that. And I think that Harris, Biden are going to be with us on it. So I will yield back to you, Tova. I'm eager to hear what my colleagues have to say here.
I feel like a member of Congress having the time yielded back to me. So I'm going to go to the state level now and ask the first question of Wendy, because obviously a lot went down in the state legislatures this year, as in other years, but especially this year. So I'm hoping for sort of the overview of where state legislatures are at, what they did during this election cycle, what changed, what didn't. And then, of course, what you might see as the prospects going forward for new legislation of any kind with respect to voting in elections.
Great. Thanks very much, Tova. And I really appreciate being included here today. Congressman Raskin, I have one thought for you, which is it might be time for some federal legislation in the context of 1986 Voter Rights Act was reauthorized, 1993 the National Voter Registration Act, 2002 the Help America Vote Act, 2009 the MOVE Act. I mean, it's been 12 years since Congress has had anything. So that's not about what's the politics in DC. That's just thinking that 12 years is a long time when you see those other increments of time prior to that. I don't know very much about what goes on in DC though, so I'll stick to my own lane, which is the states. And I will say that the election of 2020 was the election of steady states. In terms of the politics, it was not a blowout for Democrats in any way, shape, or form. If anything, it was a rollback for Democrats and a move forward for Republicans. But mostly, it was steady state. If you take the years 2020 and also add in 2019 when Virginia had its elections, you had two chambers who moved from the Democratic column to the Republican column. That was New Hampshire's two chambers this year, 2020. And in 2019, two chambers went the other direction. Those were the two chambers in Virginia. So kind of a wash. And if you look at the governors at 2019 and 2020, there wasn't much change. I believe the Kentucky governor went from Republican to Democratic. And in 2020, the governor in Montana went from Democratic to Republican, again, bringing us a wash. So if it's a wash, what does that mean in terms of power? That means that Republicans have more control in the states than Democrats do. And it's 29 states where Republicans hold the control of both chambers and 19 states where the Democrats hold control in both chambers. And if you're checking my math, that leaves us two more states. One of them is Minnesota. It has one chamber in the control of Democrats, one in control of Republicans. And that's the first time that's happened. And that was 2018 when it shifted that direction. First time in about 100 years for only one chamber to be split, meaning that there's more certainty in states that they want to be on the R side or they want to be on the D side. And then there's Nebraska, and we don't count that as a Republican state, even though most of its legislators are Republican, they run on a nonpartisan basis, which means that they are elected on a nonpartisan basis, which means we count them as nonpartisan. So it's 29R, 19D, one split, and then always wonderful Nebraska in the center. So that's the kind of the politics of it. And when it's the same people, then you'll be facing the same challenges or advantages wherever you might be. You've got the same kinds of headwinds or tailwinds coming along. But there was also that amazing election this last year, and virtually every state in the nation did some things to change up how they ran their elections. And some of those things were through legislative action, and some of those were through executive action. But it was just the message. So if you've got steady political states, then you've got change coming from the election. You put those two together, that's your backdrop for any efforts you might like to be using as you look to change for the future. So I do think that 2021 will be a year where we will see a lot of introductions and probably a lot of enactments, but it's going to come in at least 3 different flavors. And one of those flavors is, we don't like what just happened, we're rolling things back. And that could be in states that are saying, we had kind of a free-for-all on how these absentee ballots were going to be handled, and we don't like that, and we're going to step back. Or the states where they had said it's okay to use COVID as a concern for requesting an absentee ballot in the states where you do have to have a reason to request it. So I just want to say, one person's reform is not the same as somebody else's reform. So if you take reform in total, some of the reform will be more of earlier kinds of elections with a focus on in-person elections. And then there's a second kind, which would be change, of course, to codify or make permanent the changes that we saw this last year. And I do think we'll see some of that. Possibly we could look to the Western states more so than other states because they have more of a tradition of absentee voting and more mail voting to start with. So there will be some changes that are, okay, we tried it and we liked it. Some states we tried it and we didn't like it. Some states we tried it and we liked it. And then the third category, I think, is where states will just want to be more precise than they currently are on how absentee voting takes place. So if you only had 3% of your people voting absentee, there were a lot of questions that you didn't have to address. There wasn't such a thing as a ballot drop box. That didn't exist because 3% of the people, it just wasn't an issue. What to do when a voter casts an absentee ballot and then dies before election day? Does that ballot count or not? Half the states have something on record, the other half are silent, leaving it up to local election officials to decide whether to count them or not. That's the kind of thing that we're going to see uniformity in the states, where it won't be so much about more or less absentee voting. It will be clarity on what the rules are in that state. And then I'll just close, Tova, with saying that the big focus was just, it was overwhelming on absentee/mail voting this last year. And I think that we can expect that to continue forward. But if we looked at the whole decade of 2010 to 2020, it was mostly about voter registration. And there's an awful lot still there on the table. And that got completely forgotten in 2020, might come back to the table again in 2021. That's a place to look for change, perhaps. And 2 other thoughts would be cybersecurity. We, knock on wood, and I'm at a wooden desk right now. It is possible that we got through without any cybersecurity incidents of note in the election. That was fabulous, but that doesn't mean you can take your eye off the ball. So let's keep focusing on that. And a kind of a new topic is there a way to fold in the use of GIS, geographic information, into running elections? And if there is, that'll get us more efficient elections and more accurate elections, and without a lot of political heat, at least so far on that point. So that's kind of what I'm looking for as we go forward.
It's a lot, a lot of so I'm going to turn next to Carmen. So Carmen, you work with some of the more progressive state legislators around the country. And so, and you work with them exclusively on democracy issues pretty much. What are you seeing in terms of what people are thinking about for next year in terms of the legislative sessions? What do you think are the prospects for things changing, good, bad? What's your forecast?
Certainly. Thank you, Tova. Again, my name is Carmen Lopez, and I'm the Senior Democracy Director at the State Innovation Exchange. We support a 50-state network of legislators to enact pro-democracy policy that fosters more equitable participation, representation, and outcomes. So we support state legislators to fight better and fight differently as they champion democracy reform at the state level. And although we support 300 legislators in 50 states that are part of our Democracy Champion cohort, we work most intensively in a dozen states. So my comments will primarily focus on the dozen states that we work most intensively in. So I would say that broadly at the state level, we're building on the challenges and the opportunities created by the election. We'll need to play defense in nearly every state against an onslaught of attempts to enact new barriers to voter participation. We're seeing early signs of legislation that attempts to make it harder for people to register, harder to vote, and harder to use the ballot initiative process. So some examples include attempts in Michigan and Arizona to restrict or eliminate options to vote by mail, to create new voter identification requirements, reduced voting and registration options in Maryland and Michigan and Florida and Arizona. We're seeing attempts to make it harder to use the ballot initiative process, specifically in Arizona and in Florida. And I want to leave this on a happier note than I just indicated. So on the proactive side, there's a lot of energy for making permanent the reforms that were temporarily implemented for the 2020 election, and continuing to focus on removing barriers to voter participation. There was a comment in the chat a moment ago about how one squares the incredible level of voter participation in this election with, with statements about voter suppression or attempts to keep people from voting. And I'll say that the two things happen simultaneously, that we see in every election attempts to restrict who can register, restrict who can vote, and many people are turned away from the polls for those reasons. Many people are restricted from registering for those reasons. We saw people fight very hard to register and to vote in this election. There was a lot at stake, and we see what that looks like on the participation side. I think we will have wasted this opportunity of bringing all of these folks into the election if we don't continue to remove barriers to everyone's participation. There's proactive work to expand vote by mail options in Maryland and Nevada and Michigan. We will see work in Maine and in Michigan to expand early and absentee voting. There's a really exciting coalition of states that are working to expand voter language access in Colorado, in Maryland, in Florida, in Michigan, and in Nevada. We will see registration reform, including automatic voter registration and online registration in Florida and Maine, and voting rights restoration for people who were formerly incarcerated in just about every state. The proactive work, I think, will be happening in Nevada and in Washington. But I'm hearing an interest from all of our states in expanding voting rights restoration for people who were formerly incarcerated. There's some great work that I think will be done in public financing to expand public financing to folks in Maryland and Michigan and Washington. And that work, I think, is important because it provides an option for people who spend time with their constituents and are representative of their local communities to run for office and spending their time talking to folks instead of raising money. So I think all of these efforts are designed to remove barriers to people voting, remove barriers to people running for office, and to make sure that our state legislators represent the folks in their state first and foremost. So I'll leave it at that. I imagine there will be a number of questions, and I'm also interested in hearing from other folks. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carmen. Great thoughts. That was really useful. I'm next going to turn to Heather to ask the easy question. So we've been talking about sort of what's going to happen in the next year or two on election reform. And we wanted to ask you, especially given the work that Demos does, to try and really think ahead over the horizon for new possibilities, imagining new possibilities for democracy. So what do you think are sort of the bigger reform ideas going forward, sort of big picture, next 10 years or so stuff?
Yeah, I'm always happy to talk about that. Thank you. It's just really a pleasure and an honor to be with everyone. Thank you so much to Miles Rappaport for working with Tova to bring this together at the Ash Center. Congressman Raskin talked a little bit about this, definitely had his eye on the bigger prize when he was talking about what's possible and what's coming. So I'll just be brief on that subject and add maybe a few things that he didn't mention, but that I think he probably agrees with. I think it is far past time for the United States to have an affirmative right to vote in the Constitution. And there was a recent Demos report about this, which talked about what could possibly be in it and what would it look like. And I want to make sure that we have the right context for this conversation. We've never had a real representative democracy in the United States. The founders left holes in the bedrock of that revolutionary ideal in order to keep room for slavery and racial subjugation. And it has been only through long struggle that has united people of all races to fight to make the promise of democracy real and to really live out the ideal of one person, one vote. And that same force of a desire to keep concentrated wealth and power in the hands of the few versus the sort of big leap that we can take in this radical experiment of self-governance, those two poles continue to be forces in our society and continue to be at odds. And so we see the funding of lawsuits to undermine our democracy, whether it's to flood our elections with money or to curtail access to the vote and take away the protections in the middle of a rainstorm of voter suppression that would help not just African Americans for whom the Voting Rights Act was really created, but for so many millions of people who've been helped and had their citizenship made real by the Voting Rights Act protections and other pro-voter reforms that have been won by civil rights advocates. And so this is the real contest, right? And I want to be really clear that the core idea of self-governance is itself up for debate right now. We have seen what used to be sort of a fringe idea that was sort of worked behind the scenes with money and organizing and litigation and legislation, but that was unpopular, right? The idea that we actually shouldn't have a representative democracy. We have seen that sort of jump into the mainstream. And Larry Bartels, who's one of our great sociologists and political scientists who works on these issues, had a recent report that came out, a study that came out that a lot of people didn't notice because it came out in September, but it really spoke to the relationship within the white majority about what he called ethnic antagonist ideas, which are ideas that are sort of pro-white and anti-ethnic and racial minorities, and a real authoritarian impulse that rejects democracy, where the plurality and in some cases the majority of white Republicans were agreed with some very authoritative statements, such as it's hard to trust the outcome of an election when millions of people will just vote for a handout. That got 75% roughly of white Republicans. Plurality said that strong leaders sometimes have to break the rules, or that patriots might have to take up arms to defend our way of life, right? This is very, very scary. And so I want to, put the broader context of election administration and the broader context of the rules about who gets to vote within the core question of, can we be a multiracial democracy that has self-governance, where everyone has, as the Demos motto says, an equal say in our democracy for an equal chance in our economy. So we need an affirmative right to vote. We need it to be one that makes sure that we understand that the attack on the franchise is not limited. It is usually targeted towards African Americans, but it is not limited. The impact is not limited to African Americans. And so we need something that is beyond just a racial protection, but it is a right to vote in the affirmative for all citizens. We needed to promote universal voter registration by constitutionalizing automatic voter registration and same-day registration. And then we need to abolish the Electoral College and ensure the president and vice president are elected directly by the people. It's another vestige of the compromise with slavery at our founding, and it no longer serves the interests of a multiracial democracy if it ever did. I agree that we need to establish statehood for the District of Columbia and self-determination of political status to the people of the United States territories. And fundamentally, we need to make sure that whatever we do has broad enforcement powers, because the level of kind of sophistication and creativity that has been shown to be able to overcome or try to combat self-governance and representative democracy, whether it is adding fines and fees to someone's ability to register and vote after they serve their time, or it's making mail delivery more difficult, or moving polling places, or purging registered voters, right? There's going to be creativity, unfortunately, in the grab for power. We've been assured of that, really in the past decade. And so we really do need broad enforcement powers. I'll end by saying this. Democracy is not only about election administration. It's also about the core question of our commons and how we understand big public issues. What are the stories that we're telling to one another? A number of people who are part of the Ash Center, including Danielle Allen, and the Kennedy School, were a part of a really amazing effort by the American Academy to pull together a bipartisan sort of blue ribbon panel on that they called Our Common Purpose. Folks should really feel free to Google that, the Our Common Purpose by the American Academy. It was so compelling because it was bipartisan, and it endorsed a lot of bold ideas around reforming our election system, but it also included a set of ideas around social media and about the media, and a need to really revive the public interest imperative of our media, and included some really interesting ideas around how to do that. This information ecosystem that we have, where people are really relying on their own facts, and it's so easy for concentrated wealth to distort the popular imagination, is itself as much of a danger to democracy as the most violent forms of voter suppression are.
Thank you so much, Heather. I think I'm going to ask just one or two follow-up questions, and they kind of are reflective of what's been going on in the chat box and the Q&A also. We've had a bunch of variations on what do you think are the top most pressing issues to deal with? And then related to that, what can people do to help make that happen? And I would add in there that could be something, the top things that we need to do doesn't even need to be legal reform, but it could be something else. So let me start in reverse order and start with Jamie, Congressman Riceman. You are muted still.
Forgive me for my congressional myopia here, but I am very focused on us legislating quickly with the memory of the 2020 election fresh in everybody's mind, because this thing could have gone in a whole bunch of different directions based on tactics of disenfranchisement and voter suppression and voter dilution and, peeling voters away from the rolls and purging them and so on. We need to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. We've got to update the Voting Rights Act, in the wake of the Supreme Court's attempt to decapitate it in Shelby County versus Holder. We need to pass HR 1 with everything that is in there. The Senate and forgive me again, because this is maybe of a more political nature, but, the Senate is not set up on as much of a representative and democratic principle as the House of Representatives. This is why, and I think that the Senate is going to be with us, if not, for time immemorial, at least for the near term, which is why we got to make sure everybody in the country is represented in the Senate. The United States remains the only nation on earth which disenfranchises the people of its capital city in its parliament. So this is something that is, from a democratic perspective, a constitutional emergency, and we need to, I'm sorry,
You're still with us.
I'm sorry. Okay, sorry. I had some interruption. But yeah, so we need to focus on this quickly and get it done. Obviously, the probability of that changes depending on what happens in the Georgia Senate elections. But and I would view Puerto Rico very much in the same vein. I mean, we're talking about 3.5 million Americans who saw precisely the cost of having a colonial status when Hurricane Maria came, and they didn't get the aid that they needed, or the aid that they deserved. They got some paper towels. The District of Columbia has gone through the same thing with COVID-19 relief, where it was explicitly treated not like a state is treated, which is the way most federal legislation will treat it, but because of Senate legislation, it was treated as a territory and got cheated out of $750 million in COVID-19 relief. These are urgent practical problems, as well as major departures from one person, one vote democratic norms. And I think it will be a thrilling thing once we elevate these questions to the very forefront of the national political consciousness and get them done. I also, the very first bill I introduced as a state senator in Maryland was for the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. Maryland became the first state to kick it off. There are now 16 states in the District of Columbia that are part of it. I think that this is going to be our way out of all of the dysfunction of the Electoral College, which includes the presidential elections that immediately get focused on 7 or 8 states, and the vast majority of the country is forced to the sidelines as bystanders. So, the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact is basically an agreement among the states to say, we'll cast all of our electors for the winner, not within our state, but the winner nationally. And once we have 270 electors represented in this interstate coalition, it will become operative and it will become effective in every election. And I would hope we would need to go through no more than 1 or 2 presidential election cycles before Congress finally gets the idea and says, yeah, let's go ahead and abolish the Electoral College and elect presidents the way we elect governors and US senators and mayors and members of Congress. Whoever gets the most votes wins. So I think all of these things are viable and doable. And, for there are periods where electoral reform seems like something abstract and academic and nerdy and not of immediate importance to people. I think today it is of immediate importance and urgency to people, and everybody understands that. And I just think we need to pick up on the momentum and move to pass these things right away. Like first 100 days, let's do it. Nothing could be more important. And the majority's got to be able to rule.
Yeah, I mean, this is certainly the most heightened moment. There have been other moments that have felt very urgent too. And I'm just wondering, given the politics of this, and this is for Heather too, following up, that given the politics both at the national and the state level, and then especially with respect to things like constitutional amendments on the Electoral College or the right to vote. I mean, I think Professor Kazar is in the audience, but we know that there have been numerous attempts to try and get the Electoral College to be abolished. And what is it going to take to get momentum around these things so that we can overcome the politics of it and overcome how hard it is to pass a constitutional amendment? Because I did get a lot of questions about what can people do? What can groups do to help you all, to get this forward? I don't know if Heather, you want to go first on that.
Sure, happy to. Well, in terms of what people can do, which I think is always an important question to answer, people can, through whatever mechanism that they are in contact with their elected official, make sure that this is a priority and communicate it, that it remains a priority. I think there was a lot of attention, more attention focused on election administration and the rules and the deadlines than we have frankly ever seen, certainly in the modern era. And I think that's a big part of why, registration and turnout was so high. This was not something that an election that allowed people to be low attention or low information voters. It was all through the, partisan scandal framework, but that meant that the media covered it, right? And we really were very focused on election administration. And I think many of the ways to suppress the vote, might stay, in the midterms and in special elections where there's less attention and less publicity around the rules. So I don't think we should, by any means give up our focus on safeguarding the right to vote. But I think it's really important that folks follow what Congressman Raskin said, which is to make sure that HR 1 not only stays HR 1 in terms of the bill number, but in terms of the priority. And this is so important for people who care about lots of other issues, whether it's the environment or healthcare or education or coronavirus relief. All of these things that are so urgent to the American people's health and livelihoods are things that will be easier to pass if Congress passes first something to protect the voice and will of the people, right? Because there's so much fear in Washington about, Democrats running, being less focused in the midterms, about lobbyists swooping in and punishing people and super PACs punishing people for public interest votes. If something like HR 1 is able to pass, it takes away some of that threat and lets people just govern in the public interest, as we've seen time and time again at the state and local level.
Let me go to Carmen next about this topic and about, the reality of the politics, and also for both Wendy and Carmen, what can people do at the state level where really a lot of this action is? I guess that one of the questions I got a few times was, what are the top issues? But then also, what can people do? Carmen, why don't you go ahead first?
So I think that a broad reframing needs to occur to ensure that we're moving in the right direction. This includes the conversation about elimination of registration requirements or automatic universal registration and affirmative universal voting rights. And I think that this work is happening at the conversation's happening at the federal level, but the conversation is also happening at the state level. And this is really where people's opportunity for involvement is. So everyone has a representative, and most state houses are very open. People are very accessible. And it's an opportunity for people to talk about broad voting rights and the importance of all of folks' neighbors' participation, all of their family members, to begin to have this conversation in a very universal way instead of talking about very specific policies needing to be implemented or very specific administrative actions being permitted. It's a much broader conversation than we've had in this country that needs to happen. And I think that folks' opportunity for engagement is really significant and really meaningful at the local and the state level. And your second question was about what the driving policies are. So I would say that in your state, in every state in this country, the driving policies will be different. They will be very specific to what the challenges are in your specific state. But I think some of the broadest conversations that I'm hearing are about expanding vote by mail, expanding early and absentee voting, and about voting rights restoration for people who are formerly incarcerated.
And for Wendy too, your reaction to the most pressing issues and kind of how people can get involved in the debate and influence it.
Sure. I've got two thoughts. One is that I already broke my own rule. which is a rule to try to not refer to states as whole entities. This state does this, that state does this. You know, we think of them as the red states and the blue states. And we all know in our hearts that every state has conservative voters and progressive voters, and we know that they are distributed in different ways. Rural, urban is such a huge deal. But when we come right down to it, we label states as red or blue, conservative or progressive based on what 50+1% of the voters do. I'm sorry, I hope my cat isn't bothering anybody besides me. Changing our framework and starting with me, and if I could start over again, I might try a different approach, to not think so much of red states, blue states, because that reinforces us and them. And us and them doesn't work if you're on a kindergarten playground, and it doesn't work if you're at the federal level making policy. So that's my number one thing. And then on more practicalities, I'm thinking of the phrase mechanics of democracy, which I don't know if that'll catch on. I'm not sure, but it could include how we elect people. Congressperson Raskin referred to the person who gets the most votes wins, and that is definitely how most of our elections work. But everybody on this call knows that it doesn't have to be that way. And I would offer Georgia as an example. They use a runoff so that when the senators are decided, they will be elected with 50%+1, which is a different mechanism. And of course, you could come at that calling it ranked choice voting or some other alternative voting method. But really the question is, are we okay with electing people with 35, 40, 45% of the vote? Or do we want to have people elected with a majority over the 50% mark? And then another mechanic of democracy would be the primaries. How do we nominate who gets to be on the ballot? So if you are thinking structurally, this is like, here's election administration, the next level out are these structural things. And then the further out is this question of how do we stop being us and them?
Thanks, Wendy. Actually, you reminded me of another question that I can ask Congressman Raskin, I guess, first about, which is there is some conversation about the incredibly, as there is all the time, about how decentralized our elections are and how where you live determines how hard or easy it is to vote in so many instances. And there is, again, some conversation about whether we need to have some national standards or maybe a national entity that has more power than the EAC or something like that. And so I'm just interested in your reflections on doing some of those things at this point. You're on mute. Someday we're going to get it.
The point is very well taken. You know, most countries like Canada, for example, have national electoral commissions that are independent, nonpartisan, and that try to administer elections uniformly and fairly across the country. I mean, Mexico's got this electoral Supreme Court that is just focused on, you know, getting the voting practices right. We don't have anything like that. We got thousands of electoral jurisdictions that are populated and headed up by political people. I mean, everybody remembers in 2000 where the Secretary of State was also the co-chair of the Bush for President campaign. So she was in charge of administering the election fairly and then also making sure that George Bush won the election. And, you know, that is not a rare situation in our country. So I think it'll be a while before we get there. That's not this particular generation of electoral reforms where we think we are ripe on this stuff. I'm glad that Wendy mentioned ranked choice voting. I am the sponsor of a national ranked choice voting bill that we will be pushing in this Congress. But, you know, my friend Don Beyer and I have been pushing for the majority caucus to use ranked choice voting in our own elections to get people acquainted and immersed in it. People were not quite ready to do that, to give you a sense of sort of where we are in it. But I think we will be there in 2022, and we will use this term, I hope, to make dramatic progress on ranked choice voting. I think it did pass on the ballot in Alaska. Alas, it did not pass in Massachusetts. I understand from Senator Warren that it was very much of a generational thing. It passed overwhelmingly among young people. And then as you got into older generations of voters, they didn't know what it was. They didn't understand it, and they were fearful about it. So everything that we're talking about, you guys know better than anybody, requires intensive education and explanation. And that's exciting because that is the democratic process. I remember when I introduced the National Popular Vote bill, people said there's no way people are going to understand that. They're not going to pay attention to it. And people loved it because people understand there's something fundamentally problematic about the Electoral College and the way that it works. And so I got to work as a state legislator with Carmen's organization, the State Innovation Exchange, and still this process of education is going on around the country about the Electoral College. The way we've gotten most of our constitutional amendments is that it bubbled up from the states. Before we got the 19th Amendment and women's suffrage, we had dozens of state legislatures that said we are going to enfranchise women in our state. Before we got the 17th Amendment for direct election of U.S. senators, lots and lots of states were saying we are going to conduct a plebiscite and find out what the people want, and the state legislature will ratify the choices for U.S. Senate of the people. And when enough states start doing that, that's finally when Congress acts. And I can tell you, as a member of Congress, Congress is not in the forefront of change. Congress is watching and waiting to see what is taking place in the state. So I'm glad the National Popular Vote has some real momentum now. There have been lots of Republicans who've supported it. There have been Republican-controlled state legislative chambers that have voted for it. Donald Trump was attacking the Electoral College and the idea that somebody could lose the popular vote and win until the 2016 election. So every public opinion poll in America shows 70 or 80% of the people support the national popular vote idea. And I think it's just going to be really important for us to do that and leave behind, as Heather was saying, the relic of the Electoral College, which was a product of the slavery period and the 3/5 compromise. And, we could do a separate session about that. And Alex Kasar knows all about it. If Alex is on the call, hello, Alex. We've got to explain there's nothing democratic about the Electoral College. There's nothing inherent or intrinsic. We spend millions and millions of dollars promoting democracy around the world in electoral practices. One thing we never promote and nobody ever takes from us is the Electoral College. It's not like all of these Eastern European countries emerged from Stalinist communism and said, and now we want the Electoral College. No, they want to elect people by majority vote. Ranked choice voting, by the way, is an instrument, an implement of getting to majority and getting so in a way that undermines negative politics, because it creates tendencies for people to get together and to form coalitions rather than character assassination, which has become the norm in our politics. So I guess I would just say these are all things that we can do. We don't have to always be looking for the nifty new thing. These are ideas that work. We've been fighting for a long time, but we are in the precipice of being able to get this stuff passed.
Thanks, Congressman Raskin. I keep wanting to call you Jamie, sorry.
Please call me Jamie.
So Heather, did you have thoughts on that too? Whether I started out asking about whether we need to do more to have any kind of federal standards or have some sort of nonpartisan or some kind of commission at the top that actually has authority. Is that an over the horizon idea that you think is going to come up?
I think it is. I think that fundamentally, there are things that should be left to the states, but your core citizenship rights and the, functioning of our reflective and representative democracy shouldn't really be one of them. And we should have a federal floor that is high around these core issues. And if people want to innovate upwards, that's great. But that's what an affirmative right to vote in the Constitution would do. I just want to mention one thing that hasn't been mentioned at all yet, which is the need to reform the courts and to talk about the filibuster. There's a great book coming out by Adam Gentleson, who used to work for Harry Reid, called Kill Switch, which tells the history of the filibuster and how it was really became the version that it is now as a tool to combat integration and civil rights, and has allowed there to be a permanent minority supermajority, right, of states and senators who represent a minority of the country, putting a block on the kind of legislation that the country desperately needs. And so I think it's really time that we start focusing on some of those Senate rules issues, which are, also making our democracy, more sclerotic and difficult to function. And then, there was a lot of conversation, obviously, after the passing of the late, great Supreme Court Justice Ginsburg about the need to expand the court. I think a lot of that, there's been less kind of media talk about it since the election results, but fundamentally, we have to look at the role that the Supreme Court, particularly as it, has been, the subject of massive amount of, spending, lobbying, and organization to create a conservative majority that is far out of step with the representative democracy. We've got to look at expanding the court. We've got to look at innovating around terms and making sure that a judiciary, which has a ton of power to undo elections and to make some ideological moves in this society election proof and democracy proof, and threaten, our ability to respond to climate change, our ability to promote diversity, our ability to defend voting rights in our democracy. All of these core issues that are existential for our society are being threatened because of a court that has been, sort of lobbied and advocacied into, a real minority and fringe position. And I think everyone needs to pay more attention to continuing to push on that issue as well.
Yeah, I think we're going to have a whole nother session on court reform, not just the Supreme Court, but maybe the jurisdiction of the federal courts on this issue. I want to have the last questions from the audience go to Wendy and Carmen. A few people have asked about redistricting and what's going to happen with redistricting this year. So Wendy, let me ask you, first of all, for your thoughts on what the redistricting process is going to be like this upcoming year, and how it's maybe different or the same as it was going to be before.
Sure. And before I do that, Tova, I do want to say that neither I nor NCSL is actually pushing ranked choice voting. I wanted to offer that if you want to think about election administration, there are these things that sort of predate it, which is how you nominate your people, whether you have nonpartisan election officials, and what voting system you use. And there are a bunch of other voting systems between ranked choice voting. Just getting myself on record on that. Okay, redistricting, it's coming right up. For me, the most interesting thing about it is that we actually don't know when the data from the census will be coming. That's not about the apportionment numbers for how many seats each state will get in Congress. And I'm happy to talk offline about the uncertainties around when the data will come and what the data will involve. But in terms of process, there are a few more states that will be using commissions. A lot of people like to refer to them as independent commissions, but independent depends on the eye of the viewer. But in general, it is still a legislative function. And we know that partisanship is not justiciable in the federal courts. We expect there'll be more cases brought in the state courts. So I guess I'd offer that people who are not legislators want to use their usual tools to talk with, communicate with, lobby, and provide input. And also that the media will be all over it this time in a way that wasn't true 10 years ago, and definitely not true in previous years. It used to be seen as just only the most nerdy of nerds were interested, and that is so not true anymore. So I think public input is going to be dramatically different. Many states are going to offer citizens the opportunity to draw maps and submit them. So you got to be on your toes, because it is still going to be in most states a vote of the legislature on the final maps. But I think there are opportunities for input. Again, happy to talk more, but I think Carmen's probably got some things to offer on this as well.
Yeah, I won't add much to what Wendy just said, except that this is an extraordinary opportunity for every person in every state, in every county, in every city to get involved on behalf of their community and make sure that their communities are represented. And it will probably be easier actually in this next cycle than it has been historically, because there will need to be some virtual infrastructure or virtual opportunities for folks to participate from around the state that would otherwise probably need to drive several hours to do so. So this is actually a great opportunity for folks to get involved and make sure that their communities are included, that their priorities are included, and that they're able to weigh in on their own behalf. And I'll just add that.
And Wendy, I imagine there will be resources on the NCSL website about the redistricting process in each state?
Absolutely. I think if you Google NCSL redistricting 50 state models, you'll get it. Another good resource is we have the Redistricting Law 2020 book. Only the attorneys in the room want to read that. But the executive summary, which is a PDF of its own, is a pretty good explanation of why this is more complicated than just getting your own needs met. There's a lot of pieces, and that's probably a 10-minute read if anybody wants to use that as a starting point. Thank you for asking that.
Yeah, no, thanks, Wendy, and thanks for all the work that you do so that we can know what's going on with 50 or thousands of jurisdictions in the country. So we've run out of time. I wanted to just give a moment to each of you to say anything, concluding remarks, anything you didn't get to say during the discussion. If you want to just speak for a minute or two, I'll start with Jamie. You're muted.
It's been a delight to be with everybody, and I'm going to have to get right off. But I just wanted to invoke Tocqueville, who said that democracy and voting are things that are either always expanding and growing, or they're shrinking and shriveling away. And we've been in a period of contraction and real assault on basic core rights. But I think we're moving into an expansionary period where we can open up in lots of ways, all the ways we've talked about, and even other ways we haven't contemplated yet, to make democracy more robust in the country. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Congressman. I really appreciate your being here. Carmen, I'm going to go to you next on any concluding thoughts or predictions or whatever you want to offer us.
I will say on the proactive side, let's all fight in our communities, our cities, and our states to expand access and make sure that all of us can participate.
Thank you. And I'm going to go to Wendy next for any concluding or whatever you want to say.
Sure. And I just want to make it clear that legislators, and most of the kinds of reforms we've been talking about today go through legislative action, are also dealing with COVID and budget shortfalls this year. So our issues are super important, and they were highlighted by the election. But remember that these are regular, everyday people. They mostly have other jobs. They work part-time. There's only so many days in the election. So this year is a great year to start the conversation. But if you don't get what you need, just keep on moving. It's the river keeps on flowing.
Yeah, that's really helpful. That's really important to remember and put in perspective. I'm going to end up with Heather because she always has the eloquent last words for us.
Oh, well, we'll see.
No pressure.
Well, thank you for everyone. Thank you for, the 150 or so people who tuned into this conversation about democracy, as people are packing up their bags to move into their living room for the holidays, from their dining room, maybe where they've been working. I think that this core question of who are we as a people and what do we owe each other, and can we trust one another to have a say in making the decisions that shape all of our lives is the core question right now. And particularly as our country becomes more diverse, and as the anti-diversity, anti-immigration, anti-Black, sort of pro-wealthy rhetoric becomes so much an embedded part of the right-wing narrative, we really have to fight not only at the level of election administration, but at the level of core principles to reassert our basic common decency and interconnectedness, the idea that we truly do need one another, that there are things that we can do that we cannot do on our own. And that cuts across lines of class and race and ethnic origin and immigration status. We really are, when it comes down to it, human beings who all want the same things out of life. And the more people seek to divide us, based on color and class and origin, the more that the great promise of the American democracy is at risk. So I want to thank particularly Congressman Raskin for being in there in the fight and working on the urgent priorities that Americans need, despite a lot of opposition from the other chamber, and thank everyone at the state level for continuing to, to move incremental and yet powerful reforms.
Thank you so much, Heather. I knew that would be great to wrap up with. So thank you all for being here. It was a great discussion. We are having our next webinar actually this Thursday, last one of the season, and it's going to be terrific. It's going to be about the Georgia runoff and about what's going on the ground there to mobilize and organize, as well as ensure that the voting process is run well, and there is not any kind of disenfranchisement or suppression there. And so please join us. It's again at 12 o'clock on Thursday. You can get the information on the ASH website. Thank you, everybody. We will see you again